this wonderful story of the prophet Elisha and the commander Naaman from Syria is one that's certainly well known to all the people of Jesus' day. And I imagine we would gather different messages from the story than the ones that the people of Jesus' time and place would necessarily get from the story. For them, this idea that a person could be a leper and could be an active civil servant or commander of an army or something like that would have struck them as very strange. A leper is, by definition, an outcast. It's a person who's cut off from his or her society. It's a person in isolation. Something that many of us can maybe relate to more in our time these past few months and of this pandemic than we would normally. It's someone who really craves for human contact. You know, we hear about the lepers in other stories that are in the Gospels, and they seem to travel in groups. You know, we have the 10 lepers that Jesus cured, and they linger on the outskirts of towns where people come to the town boundary and they set out food for them and rags for clothing that they may need. But they don't go near them. And the lepers have to cry out, "Unclean." Doesn't mean that they're filthy, dirty. It means that they are not to be approached. And so here is Naaman, who is in the confidence of the king of Syria, and he brings great wealth with him. 10 silver talents. That's about 1,000 pounds of silver. An enormous quantity. 6,000 gold pieces. That's probably several hundred more pounds of gold. And 10 festal garments. A festal garment is one that's worked with embroidery that's probably got threads of silver and gold in it. The kind of garment that would last hundreds of years if it's cared for. And he brings the letter to the king, and he says, "I'm sending my servant to you to have you cure him." It's actually hilarious, a moment like that. And I'm sure that the people who heard it would have laughed as well. How absurd to expect the king to know how to cure a leper. As Jesus says in the gospel, there were many lepers in Israel when Naaman was sent to Elisha. So the king tears his garments, and Elisha hears about it and says, "Why did you tear your garments?" Tearing your garments is an act of desperation. "Let him come to me and find out that there is a prophet in Israel, a true prophet." So Naaman shows up, and he's told to go and wash 7 times. Now this is a humble command. Go and wash 7 times. It's an everyday kind of thing. And the challenge to Naaman here, and to the hearers of the scripture in ancient times, in Jesus' day, just as to us today, is to recognize that that humble command is one that demands our faith just as much as some extraordinary command. That what we hear from the prophets that we put our faith in needn't be anything extraordinary, but it can be just the everyday kind of thing that we live with. that too can be curative and transformative in our lives. Naaman is proud, and he's proud of his own country, and he doesn't have great respect for this land of Israel. After all, the Syrians had conquered them and had taken the little girl as a slave. And it was only by chance that Naaman heard of this prophet that might cure him. But then, too, desperation leads to humility, doesn't it? When we are so burdened or so distraught by our situations that we put aside our pretenses, we put aside our presumptions, and we give in. Eventually, that's what Naaman is able to do after his servants exhort him to do what the prophet has asked him to do. And he finally comes back and he recognizes in his humility, the humility of having been cleansed and restored to his place in society among others. Now I know that there is no God on all the earth except in Israel. Jesus confronts the same kind of demand or need for humility in his own people. Jesus himself is the humble one. And here he's come into the synagogue at Nazareth. This is very early. This is the beginning, in fact, of his ministry, his public ministry. And the people of Nazareth are saying, who is this guy? Isn't his dad the carpenter? Isn't his mother Mary? Don't we know him since he was a child? They're amazed at his preaching. But then they're skeptical. After all, he's just one of us. How does he do this? Speak with such authority. And so then Jesus says, no prophet is accepted in his own native place. I remember I chose this gospel for my first Mass when I was ordained, because I was preaching to my family and my friends. And so I was kind of trying to pass on the message that you don't have to accept me as your prophet. Just accept the gospel. But here Jesus then mentions Elijah and the widow who he fed for 3 years, and Elisha and our man Naaman and the Syrian. And this infuriates the people of Nazareth. And they take Jesus and march him off to the edge of town to a cliff, which is the cliff on which the town has been built. And they're going to throw him down headlong, but he passes through them. But what made them so angry to be reminded of Elisha and Elijah? This is a theme in each of the Gospels in some way. The theme that the people of Israel reject Jesus. They reject him for who he is. They reject his claims. It's only the poor and the humble who accept him. And then we have St. Paul's ministry to the Gentiles, simply because his own people have rejected the message of who Jesus is. Obviously, for us in this time of Lent, we hear a call to humility, to become ever more lowly so to speak. Evermore our feet planted in the reality of the world around us, in the reality of our own need, of our own sinfulness. And we turn to the Lord evermore as we walk with him towards Jerusalem.